Welcome to the Real Math of Business podcast with Alena Bennett, where you plus this podcast equals better decisions. I'm Alena Bennett, speaker, author, and leadership expert. I work with chief executive officers and chief financial officers really to help them create universally investable companies where people serve people and the math just works. This week, I'm chatting to the incredible Matt Jones, but first, here is my thought-provoking question for the week, otherwise known as the TPQ. The question is, what is your personal money story and how does that show up in your work? Now, the genesis or my thinking behind this question has come up over the last, I've been a little bit fascinated by personal money stories for quite a while, and I've always wondered, without any great intention, how does that connect or not with the role of a CFO or corporate economics? For those people who have a background in finance, they will know that personal finances are extremely difficult to corporate finances. Corporate finances where, $1 million can be a rounding error. We could only be so lucky in our personal finances. But I think why I want to surface this question is that everybody that we work with has their own money story, has their own beliefs around money, the role of money in their life and what they want from money. And so if you think about the conversations that you have around the table with your exec peers, with your stakeholders, with your team, you're now thinking about, okay, well, I'm here to have a performance conversation, not even about money. It could be the mechanics of the performance. But fundamentally, our individual and personal money story is going to be embedded with how we each communicate about the work that we're doing, about how we are performing, about, if you talk about the numbers, about the numbers. And I was having this conversation with my CFO community recently, and we were talking about the difference or the distinction between a logical conversation and a rational conversation. And why I thought this conversation was fascinating, because quite often we use the terms logical and rational interchangeably, when in actual fact, if we think about the word rational, to rationalize, when we are having conversations with people, what in their decision making, they are rationalizing their decisions through all of their different beliefs, including their money stories. So when we're trying to have a conversation around the real math of business, around the finances, and we're saying, we're talking about numbers, this is a very logical conversation. Well, not necessarily. Are you having a logical conversation or a rational conversation? How do people's money stories influence their appetite for risk and reward, and how is that showing up in the workplace? So I'll leave that with you. What is your personal money story and how does that show up in your work? And now to our chat with Matt Jones. Well, hello and welcome. It's such a pleasure today to be joined by Matt Jones, strategist, keynote speaker, brand storyteller, and co-founder of Australia's own 4 Pillars Gin. Welcome, Matt. So wonderful to have you here today.
Mate, it is fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I want to start, I haven't done this before, actually. I haven't opened with this question, but I thought, given my fondness for your product, I thought, why not? Why not just punch it out straight away? When you think about the real math of business, what do you think the real math of business is to you? How would you define that?
That's such an interesting question. I'm always sort of immediately triggered in a positive way by questions that I haven't been asked before, and I have not been asked that question
Amazing.
before. I think the real math of business, especially when you think about starting up a business and scaling a business, it's sort of the maths that you remember when you're back, doing high school maths, and you're sort of starting to learn about formulas. It's trying to understand the formula. What is the A plus B times C that's going to give you the recipe for growth? That's what immediately comes to mind for me. It's that sense of understanding the growth formula. What are the inputs that you're going to need to grow, in what proportions and in what order? And I think that's something that you sort of tend to feel your way through instinctively as you start a business. But one of the things I try and do now is I'm no longer running 4 Pillars full time, but I still consult back to 4 Pillars, and I get to consult to a few other leaders, and that's often something I'm trying to help them with, is sort of figure out what is your growth formula? What's the combination of elements that's going to give you success? So I don't know if that's how you think about the math of business, but that's what you immediately made me think of.
And the way, so the way I define it, it's a very big question and broad question. And I can't, I couldn't have asked for a more perfect answer. So thank you. Really the way I see it, it's 50% math, 50% people. And really, so what we do with our clients is really help them create a business where people serve people, and the math just works. Right. So while I say it's 50% math and people, those weightings are going to change because actually it's so interrelated. I'm always interested to hear about the backstory and kind of the career trajectory for the guests that we have on this podcast. I'm wondering if you could kind of give us that background and maybe through that storytelling, share with us what was the recipe at the time, or what was the real math formula at the time? How did you get there? Because I'm guessing that you already mentioned kind of startup to scale up, et cetera. That formula is going to change possibly quite significantly.
100%, 100%. So yeah, I'll give you without giving you my life story, I'll give you the potted history, and what I'll try and do is frame it through the lens of how did that cause me to think about the challenge of building a gin business. Remember, I was only one of 3 co-founders. So when you're sort of a collection of co-founders, I think the question for all of you is, what do I bring? What lens do I bring? What perspective do I bring? What part of that mathematical formula do I sort of represent? So for me, I've got this sort of quite eclectic career history, and it took me a while to make sense of what was going on. And increasingly, as I sort of matured in my career, I realized that the little thread that was running through everything was this idea of story, of shaping stories, of telling stories, of sharing stories, of understanding stories. My first job was in military intelligence. I didn't expect to find my way into that. I trained as an economist. I got a job in military intelligence as an economic analyst. I was really very bad at the economic analysis. I was quite good at telling the stories of what the analysis was revealing about some of the things going on in the world that the Prime Minister and the government at the time wanted to know. That took me from going, okay, well, maybe I'm not a hardcore economic analyst, but maybe I quite like words, and I quite like working with people who need to leverage words and leverage stories. So I moved into politics. I became a speechwriter, a political strategist, and politics is really the original brand training. Like, if you ever want to learn quickly how people think they are rational, but actually are deeply irrational and deeply emotionally and impulsively driven when it comes to decisions, just spend a while listening to them talk about politicians and how they feel about politicians. I moved from politics in the UK and I moved to Australia, and I moved into the world of brand. I joined a brand agency, and I joined a brand agency in 2006. It was a really fascinating time to come into this world. I was working with brands like Microsoft and IBM and Ford and Sony. And within 6 months of me entering this whole new world and learning this whole new language, Steve Jobs walks onto a stage in America and holds up this little rectangle, and he holds up the iPhone. And that's 2007. And around that time, you've got the launch of Facebook, you've got the launch of Twitter, you've got the launch of platforms like Uber and Airbnb. The world is changing in profounding ways, in digital ways, in social ways, in mobile computing ways. And all of us are scrambling to try and figure out, well, what does this mean for the new rules of business? How has, to use your phrase, how has the math of business and brand building changed? So I got really lucky. I got to spend time in Australia. I got asked to move to the United States. I moved to New York. I headed up strategy for an agency globally, really wrestling with this new landscape of how businesses can connect with their consumers, how brands can get built in this new world. I had a baby over there, not relevant to this chat. Came back to Australia, set up my own consultancy, and just as I was starting that, met these 2 other guys as equally pale and bald as me, and the 3 of us decided to try and make gin together. And they both had far more experience in the booze space. You would say they were more experienced drinkers. They were more experienced in the drinks industry than me. And I guess what I had were these sort of growing theories around the ways that businesses and brands could connect with consumers through social media, through direct to consumer. And so in 2013, as we started to shape up the plan for 4 Pillars, I had some theories about how these new techniques, these new ways of connecting could combine with, I guess, the traditional math of a drinks business, which is, you've got to great make liquid, you've got to package it beautifully, you've got to win over bartenders, you've got to win in retail, you've got to win in what you would call the trade, in the wholesale business. And we
Mm-hmm.
sort of respected that. And Stu and Cam, my co-founders, had much more knowledge of that space than me. But I also sort of flew the flag for going, yeah, but we can build a brand quite differently and disruptively as well. And we ended up being the first gin brand anywhere in the world to launch through crowdfunding. We built through social media. We built this sort of direct consumer community. And so, again, throwing your phrase back at you, we had this sense of the math of four pillars was going to be combining the traditional approach to building a spirits brand that you would recognize from the world of Diageo and Pernod Ricard and Bacardi and all the big brands that we know, the Gordon's Gin and Tanqueray Gin and Bombay Sapphire and Hendrix. But we would also try and combine this very different approach to brand building that we weren't seeing in spirits. We were seeing it in other categories. If you'd bought an Away or a July piece of luggage, or you'd bought some Warby Parker glasses, or all these brands that were suddenly popping up and going, we are just going direct consumer online and in beautiful little bricks and mortar stores. And we said, well, could we combine both of those? And I think the history of Four Pillars ever since has always been about this. And, if I had to sort of take one mathematical symbol, it's just this plus sign all the time. It's always been this and that. Like, we're going to be the best gin business we can be in that traditional sense. We're going to make great liquid. We're going to build great relationships. We're going to activate well in the trade. We're going to show up well in bars and bottle shops. And we're going to create incredible content, tell great stories, build great social community, use innovation and creativity to try and create lots of new stories and new opportunities for people to connect. We always thought about the fact that, and I talk about this all the time, that any business, and this goes back to my political training, any business wins because fundamentally the logic of the business is right, that you can articulate how you're going to create value in the world, but you need a big old plus sign with how are you creating value in people's minds? What is the logic and what is the emotion? How are you making people's lives better? How are you making the world better? But also, how are you making people feel something? And so I think that's sort of hopefully gives you a sense of, quickly, not just my career journey, but how I sort of accumulated these data points along the way about the importance of story, the importance of storytelling, the importance of emotion, the importance of experiences, and the importance of understanding how is our world changing and how can that change create opportunity in our category.
Yeah, wow. I love that. And I couldn't help when you said if there was one symbol that I could take away, it would be an and. I immediately went to Ed Sheeran, how his things are play and equals. And I was like, this is the cover of an Ed Sheeran, CD cover or something. I love that, the and, the traditional, be exceptional at the traditional and actually get the innovation, be different, the innovation, etc. Now, it's fascinating because, of course, you can run a whole business getting the traditional part right, and then you did things differently. I'm just really curious. My mind goes straight in the detail and just think, that sounds like a whole bunch of hard work. How do you do it all?
It was a whole bunch of hard work. And so we started as a trio to think about this in 2012. We got serious in 2013. We crowdfunded in the middle of 2013. We went and raised a bunch of investment, and we launched our first gin, Four Pillars Rare Dry Gin, that sort of classic black label with the copper that sort of evoked our beautiful stills and those original aesthetics. We launched that in December of 2013, and then we just ran as hard as we could for 10 years. And we're now coming up to the 12th birthday of Four Pillars. And the business is still running hard. The three co-founders aren't having to pedal as much anymore ourselves, but the business still runs hard. And you're absolutely correct. We chose the hard route. And I think if I sort of go back to the beginning, but I also think about the beginning of anyone's business. And by the way, when I say the beginning, we can begin anytime we want, right? We can reboot, we can reset, we can take some time out. I often liken running a business as to like flying a plane, and you do have permission to land. Like, if the plane isn't flying as smoothly as you want, you have permission to land and take a little walk around and think, okay, how are we going to navigate better? So I think you can start at any time. But if we talk about the true start, the true beginning, one of the things I always sort of urge entrepreneurs and founders and leaders to have is that real humility to go, my idea probably isn't as big, as good, or as novel as I think it is. Realistically, if I'm seeing a problem and I think I have this incredibly innovative idea, probably other people have seen that problem. Probably other people have tried that solution. Certainly making gin was not an idea at all. It's just a decision. Like, people have been making gin for 300 years. Like, go and tell Mr. Gordon that you've had this idea and it's distilling
right.
juniper. Like, come on, this is nothing particularly new. So you need to have the humility to go, what's going to make us different? What's going to make us successful? And another way to think of that, which is sort of something that I think human beings find uncomfortable, but it's necessary. How can I make this really hard? Because if I try and find the hard thing to do, I'm starting to find the path that other people are neither willing nor able to walk down. If I spend all my time trying to find, my son's a gamer. If I'm trying to find the cheat code, if I'm trying to find the shortcut, well, if I find one, that means one exists. And if one exists, that means other people are going to take it. That is not a defensible business. That's not a business that's going to grow defensively, that, as Warren Buffett, the famous investor, would say, that has a big, wide, deep moat around it. It's not a business that someone's going to pay me a lot of money for in the future. Let's find the hard thing. So when we at Four Pillars, we started to go, well, what's hard? The thing that was hard in Australia, because the craft gin scene was really booming overseas. Hendrix had sort of shown people that gin didn't all have to taste the same. Gin didn't have to be, I'm not going to go too much into a gin lesson, but traditional gin is called London Dry gin. It's that very classic juniper heavy style. It's Gordon's, it's Beefeater, it's Tanqueray. Good London Dry smells like a pine forest. Bad London Dry smells and tastes a bit like Pinot Clean. But it's, that London Dry style is very, very distinctive. Hendrix had sort of come along and said, well, gin can be more than that. It can be lighter, more fragrant. It can be cucumber. It can be rosewater. Lots of other craft gin producers, people like Sipsmith of London, were coming in and doing different things. There was a real craft gin boom in the United States. In fact, Stu and Cam went on a fact-finding mission to the States to kind of go, okay, well, let's go and have a look at a craft gin scene that is happening and see what they're doing and see how they're doing it. Because back here in Australia, it was not happening. So you can either go, aren't we the clever kids in the class? We've spotted that gin is a thing, and gin is happening elsewhere and it's not happening here. Or you can have the humility to go, well, maybe lots of people have spotted that. Maybe lots of people think that would be a good idea. Maybe it's really hard. Let's try and find out why it's hard. And what we found is that one of the great difficulties in Australia is it is profoundly difficult to make money in premium spirits. And I think there's probably two very important reasons for that. One is the size of our market. We are a very, very big geographic place with a relatively small number of people living here. There's a reason why, if anyone listening to this has been lucky enough to go to Japan, it's the last place on earth that still feels completely different. You come across all these brands and all these products that have been made for the Japanese and have never left Japan. And there's a reason for that. It's a vast, wealthy population in a pretty densely packed set of islands. We are the opposite. I mean, we're wealthy, but we are a small population that it's enormously spread out. So immediately you have a challenge in Australia of actually building a business to scale and making money. And then on top of that, in the spirits industry, and this really does get into the maths, we pay an extraordinary amount of excise to the government on every bottle of spirits we make. We pay the second highest level of excise per pure litre of alcohol in the world. So if you pop down to Dan Murphy's and you spend $75 on a bottle of Four Pillars or $85 on your favorite olive leaf gin, about 30 of those dollars are going to go straight to the tax man. So not only do we have to cater for the retailer to make money, the distributor to make money, we've got to make sure that the tax man gets his share. And so after that, if you think about them building a super premium gin business, a craft-led gin business, where you invest in beautiful equipment, the best botanicals in the world, you invest in a place to distill, you invest in beautiful packaging, everything is custom, everything is to that level and to that standard, that excise hit means you are going to take far longer than is realistic to start to get your money back, to start to get into the black. So that's the real maths of it. So once you identify that, you go, well, Now we've found the problem. The problem is not figuring out how to distill Australia's flavour culture into great gin. We're the most delicious place on earth. Gin is just a distillation of place. It's juniper and then whatever you want. So if the stuff you have access to, the botanicals, the fresh produce at Four Pillars, we've been pretty famous for our use of whole fresh oranges, of olive oil, of fresh Shiraz grapes. We've got access to amazing produce. Cameron has got an incredible palate. Stu's got incredible instincts for flavour. There was never any question in my mind we were going to make a great product. The question was, can we make money? Can we grow it sustainably? So that's where you then push yourself into the and you go, well, we're going to make money because we're going to build a great direct consumer business that builds decent margins into our sales, that builds consumer loyalty, that builds connection. And we've got to make sure that that drives volume, because we're not going to make a lot of money per bottle that goes into the retail channel and goes into bars, but those things are going to be critical for volume and scale. Stu drove us to really attack export really quickly as well and try and unlock more growth, but also more opportunities for Australians to go overseas and suddenly go, oh my goodness, this little gin brand I discovered in a bar in Darlinghurst last week, I just saw it at Raffles in Singapore, and then I landed in London and went to the American bar at the Savoy, and there it was in a martini. Oh my goodness, this brand's amazing. To do all of those things, to build a direct consumer business, to invest in a physical home for the brand, to also build a wholesale business and to build an export business and do it all at once, not in sequence, but in parallel, was extraordinarily hard. And I've got sort of PTSD and sort of exhaustion just saying it, but it was what we recognized, what needed to be done to make the maths of that business work and to give us a chance of building the business that we did.
I think it's fascinating about saying find the hard thing, because you and I both know everyone is peddling the shortcut at the moment. It is, how do you get there fast? And so I think it's really fascinating to go actually find the hard thing. And now you've explained the story, that makes complete sense, because you're absolutely right. There are lots of gin products out there. I want to come to the conversation that you and your co-founders had, where you actually, it sounds like, despite the fact that Stu and Cameron, is that right? Stu and Cameron were the craftsmen, right? Like they were the create. I don't know if creative's the right word, but they were kind of in the business, in it for the love of alcohol/gin.
Yep. That's exactly right.
But it sounds like the money question came up pretty quickly. Like, how do we make money from this?
On that point about finding the hard thing, I find it really fascinating. I can't take credit for. There's a fantastic marketing professor called Scott Galloway, and he talks about how strategy, the fundamental act of business strategy, is finding the hard thing that you have a disproportionate ability to execute on, and that should be at the heart of your strategy. Don't find the hard thing that you're not good at. That's not much of a strategy. That's a strategy. That's a recipe for failure. It is not a formula for success. Find the hard thing that you are willing and able to do more and better than anyone else. That's a really interesting strategy. And so that's something I've heard Scott Galloway talk away a lot, and I think is a really fascinating little nugget for anyone trying to build a business. And as you say, potentially having someone peddling the shortcut, or this is the easy way, and they should actually call bullshit on that and go, no, I want to find the hard path that is right for me.
Yeah.
In terms of building those early plans for Four Pillars, the money thing came up, but it was never a driver. The money thing was always an enabler, and I'll sort of unpack that a little bit. So I sort of talk a lot. You talk about the math of business. I quite often talk about like the cocktail recipe for success, and for me, the first two ingredients in that cocktail are this intersection of clarity and craft. And clarity speaks for itself. It's trying to really understand, what business am I getting myself into? What is success for me? What am I going to need to do and focus on? What is that hard thing that is going to unlock my right to be successful? Why am I doing this? What makes me get up in the morning? What's the bigger mission that other people are going to cheer me on for? And as you develop that clarity of focus, that clarity of ambition, that clarity of strategy, what it also allows you to do is focus on, what's my superpower going to be? What's my craft going to be? What's that thing that I then get up every day and go, gosh, there's a lot of elements swirling around. This is already a complex business we've built. but it also only comes back to one thing. And I think most of us in our own businesses, even if we wouldn't call it a craft, we can probably identify that thing that is the real unlock. It's the real magic of what we do that makes us different from all the other people who do something similar, but they don't do it the way we do it. And so for me, that relationship between clarity and craft is critical. So those are the things that we talked about at Four Pillars. We maybe didn't name it as sort of succinctly as I would in hindsight, but we were sort of wrestling with those. Like, what is the strategy for this business? What is the ambition for this business? And what fundamentally are we going to make that is going to make us stand out and make us worth buying and drinking and sharing and talking about? That fact-finding mission I referred to earlier, sending Stu and Cam over to the States to go and tour a bunch of craft distilleries, that really gave us clarity on both sides of those questions. From a flavor point of view, they came back and went, really interesting. The Americans are sort of ignoring London Dry Gin. They're quite perhaps unsurprising when you think about Americans. They're just doing their own thing. They're making American gin. So why would we make London Dry Gin 10,000 miles from London, down in the outskirts of Melbourne in the Yarra Valley? Why would we do that? And as you looked around the Australian distilling scene, there were only a handful of distilleries making gin at that time, fewer than 20. Within a decade, there were more than 300. But there were fewer than 20 when we started, and most of them were starting with a London Dry product. They were effectively going, me too. We can also make classical gin. And we're like, well, without being arrogant about it, all three of us had a bottle of Tanqueray number 10 at home, like probably the sort of benchmark super premium London Dry Gin. Like, well, why would we try and compete with Tanqueray number 10? Let's just begin with what can make us special. And what can make us special is great Australian gin. It's distilling modern Australia. What's modern Australia? Yeah, it's the cooking of Neil Perry. It's the citrus and warmth of the Mediterranean. It's the spice of Southeast Asia. So we thought, can we distill, modern Australia as flavour and distill that into gin? So that was a sort of easy commitment. And we also talked about craft in terms of its breadth or its focus. And we said, well, the world does not need another gin business. It certainly doesn't need another gin business from Australia, which is a place universally unknown for making gin. So let's have the humility to go, no one's really asking for this. And therefore, the world certainly doesn't need another gin business that's also dabbling in whiskey and vodka and rum. So we decided our craft would be modern Australian gin and gin and gin and only gin and nothing but gin. So real clarity there. But the other thing they came back and said, they were like, look, we visited about 30 distilleries. And there were probably about half a dozen where the gin just blew us away. It blew us away in terms of the purity of the spirit, the concentration of the flavors. That's a bit of maths in of itself. That's a really interesting balancing out. Like, you can make a very pure spirit that doesn't taste of much. You can pack flavor into a spirit, but it's a little bit rough and it's not going to treat you well the next day. Getting that balancing act, purity and concentration of flavor, that's really magical. That's really special. So they said every time we tasted a gin that gave us a bit of that, made the hairs stand up on our arms, we would go out to the back of that distillery, because most of these places didn't have a big sexy visitor center, some shed in Colorado or Oregon or wherever. And what they would find there is a still with this name on the front of it, Carl, C-A-R-L. They're like, that's strange. All these Americans call their stills Carl. And it's like, no, they're not named Carl. They're made by Carl. They're made by Christian Carl of Germany. And what we discovered is that Christian Carl, based outside of Stuttgart, are the best gin still makers in the world. A still is really just a very expensive kettle, and it's a very precise gin making kettle. It's also kind of like a bomb, so you handle with great care. You do not want your still to blow up. And Christian Carl make the best stills in the world for making gin. And so they came back and went, we've got to have one. And it's like, good news, bad news. No one in Australia has a Carl still. We will be the first people to be distilling gin in Australia with a Carl still. So making Australian gin with a world-class still. Fantastic. Here's the bad news. It's going to take 12 months to get one, because they're all handmade and there's a huge waiting list, and they're really, really, really expensive. And so when we then start to add in other things and go, okay, well, we're going to want to source all these botanicals. We're going to want time to experiment. While he's waiting for his Christian Carl still, Cameron wants to get a little chemistry lab still. He's going to go into his Walter White Breaking Bad phase and have this sort of mad professor distilling all these chemicals at home. we also started to think about the brand and going, well, we're going to want to launch properly with a proprietary bottle. That means getting a mold done. And everything was just dollar signs.
Mm.
And then we're like, well, and then when we launch, and Stu in particular, well, both of them, to be honest, had worked for years in the wine industry and around the wine industry, and they'd seen the mistakes that the wine industry often made of discounting too quickly, not building brand, training consumers that they should never pay full price. And we're like, well, we want to build a brand properly. So again, dollar signs, because you're going to need patience. You can't just buy your way to volume. You've got to build carefully and build slowly. So all of those things said, if we can't solve the financial challenges, we will never be able to be the best gin makers we can be. So when I said at the start of this question, we did talk about money a lot, but we talked about it as an enabler. The question was not, how can we raise lots of money so we can get rich quick? The question was, how can we spend the maximum amount of time and love and effort making the best gin we can make with the best still we can buy? What's going to be the enabler of that time, that patience, that permission to experiment, that ability to do that stuff? And the answer is going to be having a little bit of a war chest. And so that means we're going to need more money than we three can put into this. We're going to have to find some investors. So we were non-greedy. We sold 40% of our business to 20. We called them ginvestors. We thought it was cute. They bought 2% each of the business, and that gave us a little war chest. That also gave us 20 people who are now cheering us on. But we decided that a business with money in the bank, with some miles in the tank, that could have the patience and the energy and the commitment to really investing in our craft and doing things properly, that was a gin business worth building. So yes, we talked about the money at the beginning, but not because money was what motivated us, but money was going to be the fuel for the rocket.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you equip yourself to have good money conversations when you're effectively working with three creatives? At what point did you bring in a finance person? I'm curious about if and when that happened, because it does, like, I've kind of mapped out on my notes. We've got quality plus patience plus slash time. I love you want to give yourself the time to get the quality right, and money. Like that's the thing. When did you bring a finance person in?
After about 6 years. So that's not maybe the answer you're expecting. And that's not to say that we didn't take good advice along the way, but
Yeah.
we were very fortunate. I was going to say all three of us had grey hair, but predominantly all three of us had no hair. There's something quite fortunate, I think, about launching a business when you're sort of into the second or third or fourth act of your career. There is more experience, there is more wisdom. So if you look at the three of us, we all shared a love of gin, we all shared a love of storytelling, we all had an innate sense of creativity, but we also had particular strengths and particular biases. Cameron has got an unbelievable palate, had worked all around the wine industry, and he wanted to get his hands dirty again. He wanted to get back into making, and he didn't want to be a winemaker. And so he taught himself to become a gin maker. And not long after teaching himself to become a gin maker, he became the best gin maker in the world. He was the, I think, 19th person to be inducted into the World Gin Hall of Fame. He is an extraordinary. He's certainly the most awarded gin maker on the planet in the last decade. So with Cameron, we had someone who had really sophisticated instincts about how to build a business, how to build production, how to build a team. He's got a great background in hospitality, but also a real desire to make and interrogate. And Cameron also, for his sins and to his credit, he's an Olympian. He made the 96 Olympics running in the 400 meters for Australia. So he's also a very, very determined and disciplined man. So there's Cameron with all of that bundle of skills. Stu, an extraordinary communicator, had spent 20 years building a great business in his own right in the PR and communication space called Liquid Ideas. They're still going strong. They are a phenomenal PR, communications, social media agency, originally built to tell the stories of liquids, to tell the stories of wine brands, and then they diversified and diversified. So Stu, as well as being a passionate storyteller, is someone who really believes in the hospitality industry, really believes in the importance of relationships, and also has a very strong commercial sense about how to turn those beliefs into business. And then there's me with all of my beliefs around brand building, experience, this new world of social media, this new world of direct consumer, my love of design and aesthetics and storytelling and all of that. So we had this lovely triple Venn overlap of enough shared space, but also enough expertise. And I think when you think about what were we then flying the flag for, ultimately, Cameron, your job, make the best gym we can. Stu, build the best relationships we can. Matt, build the best brand we can. And those three things were powerful, powerful differentiators for Four Pillars.
Mm.
Everything else is an outcome. The
Yeah.
financial success of the business is an
Yeah.
outcome. So when we needed to ask an expert, say, how the hell do we fund this? Or how do we build a shareholder agreement? Or how do we write a first budget? Absolutely, we brought in people to help us do that. But when did we hire our first finance director full-time in the business? That was only after 5 years. And I think that in some ways helped us because it meant that leadership was always coming from the place of value creation. And we were led
Mm.
by the instincts that were the things that would create value. And maybe it was just fortunate that the business grew so fast that every time we set a target for growth, we exceeded it. So we happened to end up making more money than we expected rather than losing more money than we expected, which was a good thing. And we could keep reinvesting that in growth. So I don't want to ever sound like we were naive, but I do think the center of gravity of the business was always in that creative growth mindset. The gin first and foremost, the relationships in the trade, the brand that we built, those three sort of big growth
Mm.
cogs were always the ones that were spinning at the heart of the business.
Yeah. I'm curious, I threw out the finance because we were simply talking about money, but obviously you did your investing round and then you continued to grow and ultimately sell the company, 100% of the company. So you've gone through that startup, scale up to sale process. And I'm curious, we haven't talked about culture yet.
Mhm.
And I know that that's incredibly important for you. And I'm, and when we know, particularly that startup to scale up, you need to have the right people on the bus all going in the right direction, all of the things. I'm really curious about how going through those changes, those inflection points in the business, how did that galvanize or shake, or what did that do to, it's very easy to have those three pillars fully in place when there are three people, and then it just gets a little bit harder as you
Yeah.
grow. Tell me about that journey.
Yeah, look, it's such a good one, and I was about to say there's a book to be written about that, but I did write that book, or at least I had a go at writing that book, because it is fascinating, and I thought it was worth trying to write down some of those learnings because you
Nice.
forget, right? Like time sort of erases some of that clarity you had, and first of all, you're 100% correct that in the early days as a founding trio, there is this sort of almost like unspoken understanding between the three of you. But even then, even if it's unspoken, it was important to me that it was written down. And I think,
Mm.
Stu and Cam would be the first to say as well that one of my sort of unofficial jobs in the trio was to be the documenter of the logic. That as we would have discussions and we've always got on incredibly well and we became fast friends, but I think we also became very fast collaborators who fundamentally understood each other and where we were coming from and how we could sort of work together and create value together. It was always my job out of those sessions to go, right, I'm now going to try and capture that and document that. And I love a PowerPoint, I love a chart, I love a strategy, I love a structure. And so trying to put those things in. So I think one of the things that you have to do very early on, even if you're a solo founder, keep telling yourself the story of what you're doing, why you're doing it, why you deserve to be successful, and how you're going to grow. Like that notion of, stories are how we remember as humans. We remember stories better than strategies. We remember stories better than charts and on all these kind of, planning constructs. Even if it's just you in a room on your own and you think people are going to think you're crazy, tell yourself the story out loud. What is the story of my business and my plan and my right to win? And so then as you bring people on, one of the stories that you need to interrogate is, what's the story of the next capability we need? And sometimes that will be, in the case of Four Pillars, where we've got this co-founding trio, and I think that was a superpower for us. A lot of people would have said, you need to pick one of you to be the CEO. We chose to be co-CEOs. We chose to have all three of us have one hand on the steering wheel, and it worked.
Mm.
It worked really well for us. And one of the reasons it worked was something you highlighted earlier in this conversation, the sheer complexity of our business. We needed three CEOs because we had about 3 business worths of efforts to manage. Cameron was the CEO of gin, and Stu was the CEO of growth and relationships in the trade, and I was really CEO of brand and direct consumer, and we all had a business to run within this one thing called Four Pillars. And so then as you grow, the story of capability is an interesting one. Sometimes you go, well, we need to amplify Cameron's gin making muscle. We need more of that. Like we are running out of Cameron, or we're running out of Stu. So some of the first hires we made were people, Cameron always says the first people who came in to help him were the people who keep him out of jail. Because if he was focusing on making the gin, he needed people to help him focus on paying the excise bill and making sure people got paid and payroll happened and all those things. Stu needed people to help him because he was opening so many doors in the trade and in the industry. He needed people to walk through those doors with him. I had so many ideas about how to build this direct consumer brand, needed people to come on board and help with that. So some of those stories of capability growth are about simply amplifying what's working. But then, and this is, I think, at the heart of your question, and your question earlier about bringing in a finance leader, you start to need to add capabilities that are things that you did not have in the business. And with those new capabilities come new instincts. So I think what's really critical there, whether we are talking about strategy or whether we're talking about culture, we have to align people to both. We have to align people to our strategy. I sometimes say, well, your strategy isn't a strategy unless you can tell it as a story. And at the heart of your story needs to be the story of why you exist and how you're going to grow. You need that real clarity of theory of growth. So you bring those new people in. You've brought them in because they have different skills, because they've got different experiences. They've come from places not like where you came from. You're going to have to work hard to align them to your worldview, to your perspective, to your way of thinking about the business. And you need to leave enough room for them to add value and say, yeah, I hear you, but have you thought about this? So you also need to create room for that story of how you're going to grow to evolve and include them. Like there was a reason you brought them in as the Avengers just got one superhero bigger. Like you need to make room for their superpower. And then in culture, they've come from a place where maybe people carried themselves with different values, where people's instincts around making decisions, around how we show up around here, how we behave around here, were a little bit different. So again, you need to both align them to that culture. How do we do that? Through storytelling, through experience, through immersion. Culture is something that happens through osmosis. You don't sort of get lectured on the culture. You feel the culture and you pick up the culture. The culture is a vibe, but it has to be intentional. Just because we can't tell people they have to behave culture doesn't mean we can't be intentional with the culture we build. But again, you've got to create room for people to enhance the culture. So as we grew, you have this combination of three things happening. One, amplification of those core capabilities. Two, sort of enrichment and adding these new capabilities. And then three, over time, you just start to add scale. And that's probably the scariest bit, because at that moment when you're adding scale, it's probably because also your business is changing materially out in the world. And, the way you address the category and the way you're sort of trying to grow through customers, potentially that's changing as well. And I think though perhaps that moment, and we hit that moment at about 5 or 6 years, that's the scariest time from a cultural point of view.
How did you personally deal with that fear?
My way of dealing with all fear, and if you asked my wife, she'd probably say not very well. But my way of trying to deal with fear typically is to try and make sense of it. It's to try and sort of fight it with logic. So at that point when Four Pillars is starting to get uncomfortable, there's a great title of a book, a leadership book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And that moment when you realize that what got us here might not be the thing that gets us there is a scary moment. And, there's a bit of fight or flight or freeze, right? Where you're like, well, do I just ignore that fact and just keep doing what I'm doing? Or do I throw that away and start doing these new things? But then do I risk throwing away the magic as well? Like it can be quite a paralyzing thing. And I think anyone listening to this or watching this who's worked in business, running a business, they'll recognize those moments. And then you're getting so much advice, and all these people with good intentions are telling you need to do more of this or less of this. And it's quite overwhelming. So for me, the way I try and deal with that is to go back to first principles and say, well, what does make us special, and do those things still make us special, and who is going to drive our next phase of growth? So the big thing with Four Pillars was realizing that we'd gone from a world where the day that we launched in December 2013, that was, we were 1 month away from the end of the year. And that year, Hendrix had 60% of super premium gin in Australia. So that meant 6 out of 10 bottles of gin sold over $70 were one brand with one product. By 2019, we were catching Hendrix fast. By 2021, more Four Pillars was being sold in Australia than Hendrix.
Wow.
So we were well on that trajectory. And so as you look at those numbers and you look at this doubling and trebling of volumes year on year, you go, well, wait a minute. The kind of people who were buying in the early days are potentially quite different to the kind of people who are going to drive our next wave of growth. Just to take a little sidestep for a second. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news for entrepreneurs, but often the earliest sales you make are the easiest ones. And I don't necessarily mean the sales you make to sort of friends and family and people who feel sorry for you, but we value those sales, right? When we start something new, it's like when you announce that you're going to do a marathon for charity, and, immediately friends and family are chipping in, and it's like, okay, but I need a bit more, I need a bit more custom. I need a bit more support. It's the same in a business, but the easiest sales in some ways are the first consumer sales, because people put their hands up and go, I am disproportionately interested in this category. So in our case, I'm disproportionately excited about gin and craft, and I try everything new, and I go to gin tasting events, and I lean into novelty, and I've got a big collection of gin at home and all those things. Those people are amazing, but those people are few and far between. The far more normal consumer goes, I've normally got a bottle of gin at home. And when I run out of gin, I put it on the list. And next time I'm near a Dan Murphy's or a BWS or a Liquorland, I pop in and I get another bottle of gin. And typically I have one. And it used to be Bombay Sapphire, and more recently it's Hendrix. Why should it be you? That's a very different consumer. That's a different consumer that's engaging with the category differently. So you have to constantly have this willingness, I think, to both think inside out, particularly in the early days. What makes us special? What gives us a right to succeed? And how do we show that to the world? And how do we take that to the world? But you have to be able to balance that with this outside-in perspective. No one gave us the right to be successful. No one has to feel sorry for us. No one owes us their dollars. So we have to think like the customer, think like the category, and recognize that the category is not standing still. Our competitors are not standing still. Those people who've seen Four Pillars grow 2-3 times in scale every year for 5 years aren't just sitting around going, good for them. And so you have to sort of keep letting data from the outside world in, and it's scary and it's discomforting. But I think the way you deal with it is by giving yourself the time to think about it. Often it feels scary because we're trying to figure out at 8:55 a.m. what decision we're going to make at 9 a.m. based on that data. We can't do that. Instead, I think we've got to go, look, for the most part, this new information doesn't mean the world is on fire. Things are okay. The ship is not sinking. But if new stuff is happening and things are changing, we need to give ourselves proper time to learn, to collect data, to make sense of what's happening, to then interrogate ourselves. What do we still believe in? Time is a gift. Thinking is a gift. We exist in a landscape now where there is almost this shortcut culture. There is this hustle culture. There is this sense that if you're not doing, you're not achieving anything. So you need to be action. I need to think. And I think, obviously thinking that leads you to analysis paralysis by definition is not helpful. But like every extreme, there is an extreme at the other end of the spectrum that is also not helpful. And just sort of firefighting and moving faster and faster and being busy while potentially you're going broke is not helpful either. There is a middle ground. So for me, that's how I've always dealt with that fear, is to try to slow down, think about it and go, well, look, even if things are changing, there's a lot of great stuff we did that made us successful There is now stuff changing. Let's wrestle with that. Let's sit with the ambiguity of that for a while. Let's seek out the new data. Let's also keep having these conversations with ourselves about what we believe in and what makes us special. Again, we're back to that and we're back to that combination. And out of that sense making, let's give ourselves the new clarity. Let's tell ourselves a new story about how we're going to grow. Let's make sure we tell everyone in the business that story. Let's get everyone singing from that same song sheet, finding their own connection. In a way, organizational strategy and organizational culture is about having the big tent story, and everyone can tell their own story within it. Everyone, whether they're at 4 pillars in packaging, in logistics on the bottling line, in distilling, in customer service, working on the bar, out in the field, in sales, in marketing, in social media, they can all tell a story. This is what I do. It ladders up to this strategy, which connects to this part of what we're doing as a business, which is going to help us achieve this ambition. We're just trying to create these Russian dolls of stories that hopefully make sense to everyone, shape everyone's efforts, build culture, build conviction, and then let's go and let's get it done.
I can see why you've been so successful internally and externally with your storytelling, Matt, because as we've spoken today, I see imagery a lot. I see I see circles, I see shapes, and very memorable. So it is unsurprising to me how you have successfully grown and sold 4 pillars, because I'm experiencing all of that now. This has been such an incredible conversation, and I feel like we've just hit the tip of the iceberg. So I look forward to the next conversation. But what really strikes me, and I don't think we've said the word, but what really strikes me from this conversation, Matt, is the word integrity. I've got it written in my notes with a circle. You, Stu, and Cameron have brought such a profound level of integrity into everything that you've done. And I'm guessing that is what's contributed to not only the fast growing success, but the scalability and the sustained success that 4 Pillars has had, because this is no shortcut. This is not, how do we sell quick to people who, just want to have a quick drink and off you go. This is bigger than that. And, your reference to time, you use the word firefighting. I talk about that all the time with the execs I work with, and quite often we reward being in that firefighting state. So I love coming back to kind of that formula or that equation that you alluded to around, patience and time, quality, and then money just enabling all of that. I kind of reinterpret that in my head and go, well, need more time? Go and make some money and buy that time. There's a great book, Buy Back Your Time. I'm not sure if you've read that, but it's so clever, and I think it comes back to quality/integrity. It sounds like what you have done has had integrity of quality, integrity of taste, integrity of story, at its integrity of relationships, at the heart of everything that you've done. So well done for your success.
Thank you, and it's lovely to have that played back, and yeah, I think there is fundamentally an integrity in deciding to build a business with that humility to go, no one asked us to build this. The world probably didn't need another business. It certainly didn't need another gin business. So if we are going to have the arrogance to try and launch another gin onto the world, we'd better bloody do it well. And we better do it with no shortcuts. We better do it with full conviction, with a clarity of purpose and a clarity of intent. And then, because we've asked people to invest in it, we better try and find a way to get them their money back. So also, let's not just be smug with that integrity and go, we know we did things well. Let's also try and tell our stories well, because it turns out all of us as consumers, we like buying things from people. We like rewarding people with our hard-earned money who we think have worked hard to do that thing, to make that thing, to do it well, and to think of us as they do it and to try and do the best by us. So I think you can build a really virtuous relationship between the integrity you bring internally and then the integrity that you're credited with by your customers.
Yeah, wow. Matt, if anyone wanted to learn more about you, hear more from you, work with you, what would be the best way for them to find you?
I'm easily found on LinkedIn. Probably put Matt Jones and gin in, and you'll see my bald, smiling head there. I've written a book called Lessons from Gin, available in all good bookshops. And I would make the joke in some bad bookshops as well, but there's no such thing as a bad bookshop in the world. Go and support your local bookshop. Or if you really can't be bothered or you're too far away, jump onto Amazon. It's available in audiobook with my dulcet tones. It's available in Kindle and, of course, in paperback. So Lessons from Gin is a good primer. But I'm super easy to find on LinkedIn. My consultancy is called Think Story Experience. Hopefully, from the conversation we've had, you can see why I chose those three words. So thinkstoryexperience.com has a bit more about me, and yeah, always love to connect with good people and talk about building good businesses.
Well, I appreciate you for your stories, your provocative thinking, and the experience that I've had today. So thank you so much, Matt. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Can't wait to have you back.
Thanks for having me. See you in season 2.
And what a great chat with Matt Jones. It was wonderful. I learned so much. This leads us right into our listener question. And if you want to submit a listener question, you can now email us at realmathofbusiness@gmail.com, or you can simply leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and hopefully we can get it into a future episode. This week's question is from Penelope. Hi, Penelope. Dear Alena, dealing with business and people can take up a lot of headspace. I know. I'm an entrepreneur. How do you approach leaving work at work and begin able to actually relax when you leave the office and shut the laptop? Thank you, Penelope. Now, Penelope, I'm going to start with a really boring answer for you, but it is probably the biggest gateway to, I'll call it freedom from work. One of the things I love to do with every client is get their calendar right. And I know that sounds really boring. And actually, as an entrepreneur yourself, that might actually give you, little seizures. But I got some advice from one of my very early mentors, and it has stuck with me ever since. He said, if everything is in your calendar, all you need to do is show up. So if you think about yourself as an entrepreneur, no doubt, Penelope, you are very busy. You have a lot of people vying for your time, and you probably are somewhat crippled by the array of ideas that are constantly going through your head. So there's a lot of noise here. One of the things that can be particularly useful is having clarity of time, having real boundaries around this is what I do then, this is what I do then. Because what that does is it reduces the decision-making required about where do I spend my time. So the advice I got was, if you have everything in your calendar, all you need to do is show up. It takes away that decision-making that needs to happen every 15 minutes or every hour or every 2 hours. So my first thing I would say is get everything, including your personal stuff, into your calendar. Now, at first, when you do this for the first time, it will be scary. Your calendar will blow up and you won't have enough time to do all of the things. But hey, isn't that great data? So that's sort of tip number 1. Tip number 2 is purposefully bookend your days with relaxing stuff. So one of the things that I've just started doing, I've called it a little bit of an experiment, is finish my Friday afternoons with a bathhouse. So, the work week, like yourself, Penelope, is quite busy. There's a lot of kids' activities that need to happen, in and around all of the work. So, lots of early mornings, late nights over the course of the week. So for me, like yourself, there's always something to do. So, I finish on a Friday afternoon and there's always, I could just do this, or I could just get a head start on that for next week, or, I could just quickly review this for my team. What I have just started doing is booking myself into the local bathhouse and spend an hour there. And what I love about that is it's a commitment that I have paid for. So there's that incentive of I should get there to honour my commitment, but also being a bathhouse, it fully physically relaxes my mind and my body because of the steam and the sauna, the cold plunge, the hot plunge. It physically changes my inner state as well as my outer state. So that, this is week 3 of the experiment. What I can say is that it seems to be having that desired effect. What I will also say is I've had to specifically, the couple of hours after the bathhouse, I have had to put in my calendar in big capitals, rest. Yeah, because I know otherwise I will just quickly check the emails and get back on. So that's tip number 2, bookend your days with relaxing stuff, whether that is, for me, there's the bathhouse, I surf in the mornings. The kids obviously keep things busy at times, but be really intentional about your time because otherwise, work will bleed into every element. Point number 3, have an amazing team to keep you accountable. My team is so brilliant. I tell them my intentions around my time. I tell them how I'm going with my energy. I'm telling them my energetic patterns. and I'm asking them. So they asked me actually last week, oh, we've seen this bathhouse time come into your calendar on a Friday afternoon. Is that real? Because it sounds so luxurious. And I said, actually, yes, that's real. And so they said, so we can't book anything over it. And I said, no. So you need to have an amazing team around you to hold you to account and to keep those intentions in place. And then all of that probably sounds really good. And, there'd be some of you that are rolling their eyes going, Alena, that all sounds a little bit airy-fairy and perfect world stuff. Look, the reality is if you're an entrepreneur, and even those CEOs that are listening to this, the reality is that you're probably always thinking about work. And that's okay. As an entrepreneur, you have gone into business for a particular reason. And that'd be because it's a particular reason that is close to your heart, that you're passionate about. Those CEOs I work with love what they do. So what I would just say kind of as the reality check to all of that is if you find yourself or your mind drifting off into work in your so-called personal time, don't stress. Like they say with meditation, let the thought come in like a cloud, let it pass through, and just go with it. You're in business because you love it. There's nothing wrong with that. So Penelope, I hope that's helpful and gives you some things to think about and some practical ideas to take away. Thank you for listening to The Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett. If you liked this episode, remember to subscribe for more content and stay on top of the real math of business. I've been Alena Bennett. Thank you for listening.